Welcome to Talkin Divorce. Real conversation, real guidance. With Donald Schweitzer and Laurie McShane.
Today, we're discussing gray divorce and the unique opportunities and challenges that come with starting over later in life. Joining us are Michelle Cantrell, founder and clinical director of the Center for Growth and Connection, and certified divorce coach and certified health and life coach, Kathy Kloman. And together, we'll explore the emotional, financial, and personal side of moving forward with confidence into your next chapter. Okay, so in our series, our Gray Divorce series, we've learned so much in our past episode, and then now we actually get to peel back the onion a little bit on the layers and really dive into the emotional side of things and, a whole new chapter and what to expect from it and how to do it, right? So, Dawn, I know you mentioned earlier that you have a lot of clients that are, the baby boomers and, kind of going through that. And so I'm going to toss it to you so you can wow us.
Well, I don't know if it's going to wow you, but I'll tell you, if you heard about my very first case of it, when I became a private practitioner, starting my own practice, my very first client was a 76-year-old woman. Mm-hmm. Her husband was, I think, 85 years old, and they went through a divorce. And you talk about making your head spin. When you talk about people getting a divorce that have been married for 40, 50, 60 years, that doesn't happen in real life, right? Why would you do that? What I've learned from being a divorce attorney, and I know that our guests are going to confirm this, is that, believe it or not all marriages are happy.
Yeah.
And some people stay together way longer than they probably should. And believe it or not, even people that are elderly decide sometimes that, it's better living alone or without this person anymore. So we're going to talk about that. We brought in Michelle. Michelle is an expert on gray divorces. She's a licensed therapist. We're going to talk a lot about that, and that's what I want to do, is really focus, because it's been such a fascinating thing in my practice. Because as you know, is that there's been an increase in divorces with people that are baby boomers.
Yeah.
And I'm a baby boomer, so I might be able to reflect on why we do things like that. And then we've got Kathy again here, who's going to help us continue to talk about some of the things that people that are going through that can think about in surviving, because it's all about survival when you're going through this, right? So I always start with you, Michelle. How much in your own practice have you seen gray divorces? I mean, has there been an increase? Or, by the way, how many years have you practiced?
Well, I've been in practice for 12 years.
Okay.
And I never envisioned being a specialist in gray divorce. It was not my specialty. I originally started out working with eating disorders and trauma, and quickly learned that people tend to find creative ways to cope with dysfunctional relationships. So I became obsessed with working with relationships, and I then ultimately started working with couples and became very passionate about actually helping couples preserve their marriage, and not just preserve, but learn to thrive in their relationships and find safe, secure connections. And then I went through my own divorce, which I never anticipated happening. And I just felt like I could take my professional training as a therapist and a marriage therapist and then my personal experience and share that in a way that helped me understand what people are going through. And so what we do know is that 1 in 3 divorces are now happening with people 50 and above. And so the numbers are actually increasing for older folks getting divorced, while they are decreasing for the younger generations, which I think is fascinating.
But maybe sad, because there's not going to be a job for divorce attorneys after. Go ahead.
True. We don't want to work ourselves out of a job
That's
here.
right.
But yeah. And so I think it's important to really understand the particular nuances that happen with gray divorce, because while divorce at any age can be difficult and traumatic and provide or come with a lot of insecurity and fear, the unique intersection of life transitions that happen during a time when we call gray divorce, which we define as 50 and up generally. We've got, for women, the co-occurrence often of menopause and perimenopause, so major transitions internally happening. And then it also coincides often with becoming an empty nester, and then maybe aging parents that you might be caring for. And so you have all of these factors while your whole life is going through this monumental change, and really understanding how the impact of those forces converging can have on a person.
All those things you mentioned, I've seen before, and that, and I'm glad that I'm hearing that from you, particularly that last one, about aging parents. I've seen marriages break up because a spouse wants to travel to the East Coast to take care of mom, who's, alone and stuff, and that was just the deciding factor, and stuff. So today we're not going to talk about how to save the marriage, if you don't mind. 'Cause I know you're a relationship expert. I mean, that's what you do. You help people in relationships, but you also, as part of your profession, found your calling because you went through your own divorce, and then you've seen this uptick. So I think I'm the only baby boomer among us. So as an expert, I could tell you that we're very self-centered. Okay? Baby boomers were the ones that got everything, right? It was during the post-World War II boom, America was big, you got whatever you wanted, everybody had jobs, everybody had a second car, it didn't matter, right? And so we were kind of like, I think in a way, entitled to what we wanted. We had rock and roll, we had all the fun stuff. And it seems like we're very independent and a little bit self-centered. I don't know if any of you have observed that in the baby boomer generation, but it seems like that to me. So when you're dealing with folks that are going through this painful experience, do you see that it's a personality type at the ages, or is it just something other than the generation they're in?
Well, certainly that can factor into it, but I think we all have selfish parts. I think everybody has selfish parts, and I think when we are in, a safe, secure connection, marriage, whatever relationship we're in, we can make room for some of those parts while still being collaborative and interdependent. In divorce, I think some of those selfish parts can get louder. And maybe in some ways, Dawn, I think rightfully so. I think especially if you've existed in a relationship where maybe it's sort of veered on the other side of things, where there's been a lot of self-sacrifice and self-serving, or self-sacrifice and giving, that there might actually be room for somebody to become a little more selfish and say, you know what, this way of living is no longer working for me. So I don't want to, paint this broad picture of this decision being informed by any particular personality type. I think it's people are waking up and saying, I want something more than what I have. And there's often really good reason for wanting that.
I've heard one theory, Kathy, and that is that, people are living longer.
Yes.
And being in a sustained, happy, healthy relationship longer becomes harder and harder as people are getting older.
Yeah.
Where, the average person would live to be maybe 60 years old in our grandparents' generation. Now people are living till to be 90. And believe it or not, I've seen people divorcing at the age of 90. Maybe they have something to do with it too. But it's like I always say, is we'll never know, right? But the important thing is that there's people that understand it, like you, Michelle, who are here to help. And it's like I said, it seems like you found your calling. So thank goodness, because I think it's probably more painful for people that are in their 60s or 70s that are experiencing that. In our first segment we talked about what it's like for that trauma to hit, and if you're not ready for it, you don't have the finances, you don't have the wherewithal to reboot yourself. It's like being at sea without a life preserver, And so when you're dealing with these folks that are coming to you and saying, "Hey, help me," what are some of the techniques? What are the things that you do to help them?
Well, what I have found with the folks that I work with is that a lot of them are coming in really not understanding who they are outside of a relationship. And they have been more in relationship with their partner and more in relationship with the relationship and less in relationship with themselves. So in the early stages of divorce, of course, there's sort of the acute grieving. And that's a whole different conversation, is the grief. And I know that you've already talked about that some in your other segment.
Well, off camera, you and I talked,
Yeah.
and Kathy talked about it. Maybe we'll find some time for that, because that's fascinating. But
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah,
We'll,
yeah.
we'll put a
little pin in it?
Yes,
So certainly in the early stages, it's really like self-care and making sure you're getting enough water and you're eating and you're not spending too much time in isolation. But beyond that, it becomes a journey of self-discovery and really falling in love with yourself and becoming the person you've been waiting for your whole life. And so there's a lot of different ways we can do that. It can be just, I think about it sort of like when you're raising a child and you're just letting them, take piano and horseback riding lessons or coloring or trying out for the school play. It's like, let's just see what feels good and experiment and figure out what that looks like in the context of your life.
Yeah, I like the
Yeah.
fact that you're saying rediscover yourself.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I feel so many people, no matter what age, going through a traumatic experience, they always have to rediscover themselves and pivot here and stuff like that. I know, Kathy, you help women in the health coach department as well, right?
I do.
Through the menopausal, and you combine that with your coaching.
Yeah.
That's huge.
It's helpful, I think, to women.
Yeah.
To your point about the, when you go through divorce, it's okay to be a little selfish. So I think with the gray divorce, a lot of times women especially women who have been home with their kids, they're empty nesters, and all of a sudden they do start to realize that they need to be a little selfish because they were giving all that energy to the kids, right? And then they're looking at their husband and just, there's emptiness there or something. So, and that plays into the rediscovery. And the health coaching, to your point about the menopause thing, it's very helpful for women who are, going through divorce, who aren't taking care of themselves, because you see a lot of not eating, not drinking enough water, maybe drinking a little bit too much wine. So the health coaching is a really good combination with the life, with the divorce coaching or the life coaching to help women get through it.
Yeah.
Michelle, so going back to that topic when you were talking about the grieving process,
Yes.
it was a fascinating discussion off camera. Unfortunately, we cut it so we could save it for the show here. Talk to us about your thoughts on that. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, when my marriage ended, I jumped into it, and it was not my choice. But I was quick to accept what I had no control over, and so I kind of leapt into that sort of post-marriage self-discovery phase, and I really bypassed the grieving part. And about a year into my process, it all hit me at once, and I realized that had my husband died, I would have been surrounded by people. People would have been making sure I wasn't alone. People would have been setting up a meal train delivery service for me. People would have been saying, it's okay if you don't shower for a week, take time off of work, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. I would not have been grieving alone. There would have been a memorial service where there would have been, people gathered to share in the mourning and the loss of someone important in my life. That doesn't happen with divorce. Everybody else is just going on, and I'm expected to go on as if nothing has happened. But my body has experienced it as a death. There's a grief specialist, Mary Frances O'Connor, who talks about the neurobiology and physiology of grief and how our bodies don't actually accept that the person is gone. And so we have no rituals in place. This is why we have rituals for people when they die. We have the memorial service. We see the body in a coffin, and our brains can start to make sense of what's happening. We have no mechanisms for processing that in the divorce process. And so I created my own ritual for myself. I brought in some close friends, and it was such a healing experience, because even though many of my friends had actually never met my ex, they were all crying with me. And it was the first time I didn't feel alone in the grieving process. And it's something I think is so important to talk about when we're talking about divorce. And of course, this isn't just the case for gray divorce, but any significant breakup and divorce, that we really need to not just provide support, but rituals to help people move through that grief.
Wow. The rituals is interesting. Tell me what people could think of as a healthy ritual, going through the grieving process?
Well, of course, it would have to be really individual to each particular person. In my case, it involved bringing out notes and cards and letters that my ex had written me and processing that with the people that were sharing my experience. It can be, going to a special spot and creating a new meaning around it. There can be any number of ways to do it. But I think part of what might be important is not feeling like you're doing it alone. And bringing safe and trusted people who can help hold space. I think so many well-intentioned people, when somebody they care about is going through this, will say, well, you're better off without them, or, let's jump into dating, or, that people don't like to make room for the grief that comes with it. So really finding the people that can support that for you.
In our first segment, we were talking a little bit, just touched on the fact that there is a world out there of divorced people, right? Do you have any groups in mind that people can join in that? Besides giving the individual therapy, do you suggest that they take part of any kind of groups or anything like that?
I think there is a broad range of groups, and I'm sure, Kathy, you can speak to that also. Whether it's more of a processing support therapy group or or a peer support group. There's so many resources out there, but I think the most important thing is just to find ways to not go through this alone and feel like, another thing that I see in my practice is that, that particularly I work with a lot of women going through this. The women I tend to work with have existed in very high functioning ways, and they're high achieving. And so it actually in some ways doesn't occur to them that they shouldn't be going through this alone, other than being they think the therapy room is the place to process it. And I want to create a safe container for that. But that really, it needs to be more expansive than that. But it doesn't occur to a lot of the folks that we work with that they can and should seek help and reach out for support.
Yeah. One of the things that people do frequently, not all people, is they kind of start dating right away after the divorce starts, right? And I know there's kind of a stigma, don't do that and stuff, but let's face it, sometimes it feels good to be liked again.
And get that attention and be desired and like, what? I have 800 likes? What?
What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's no timeline.
Okay.
I think there's no timeline. I think that the most important thing when somebody's ready to, this is true whether you're just out of a breakup or not, is to try and get clear about what it is that you need and want at any given moment. I think there are certain things that could be helpful to be in place if you decide you want to start looking into a serious relationship. But I think there's something to that, Lori, is like getting the attention, feeling desired, feeling somebody make effort to want to be with you, especially, a lot of when you're talking about marriages that have lasted 20, 30 years, a lot of the energy has gone out of the not just sexual energy, not just romantic energy, but just physical energy. There's not the effort there. So I think there are elements to jumping into dating that can be really healing. I think the one thing to pay attention to is that it can also stall the grieving process, because like drinking wine, it can be another form of distraction. And so just making sure as you're going along in the process, can we make room for some of the other hard stuff too?
Yeah, it's pretty profound, because I could see most of us wanting to just mask that pain. Yeah. And you could do that no better way than to meet somebody and they love you to death and they're taking care of you and you're really not really thinking about it. And what happens when people don't give themselves time to grieve? What are the side effects of that?
Come back to bite them in the butt. Yeah. I think it'll show up in ways that require continued avoidance. I think that's probably one of the biggest things. I think if we don't make room to grieve, the grief is still going to be inside you. It's going to exist in your body. And if you're not making space to grieve, you're going to need to start seeking out ways to keep that swept under the rug. So it might be more drinking wine. It might be going out on a date every night. It might be other ways of avoidance. Look, I think we're all really good at compartmentalizing, and we need to be. And if we continue to keep it in a compartment, it's going to come back. Yeah. And it might show up as you decide you want to get into other relationships, if you haven't processed that grief, it's going to start to affect how you show up in your next relationship.
Yeah, but also health-wise too, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's a big like pit in your stomach, and that could really take a toll on somebody.
Kathy, as a divorce coach, right? I'm just going to guess, but it's kind of like having a coach for sports or a mentor for somebody that is trying to achieve something. Some of the basics, like having rituals, making sure that you're doing certain things per day to help yourself.
Right.
And one of them is exercise, I would think, right?
Yeah.
So are there like some things, routines that you could think of that people could at least try to make themselves, a little stronger through the process?
Well, it's individual, but I just always encourage people, you get up in the morning, drink a glass of water, sit outside for 10 minutes, take a walk, slowly add things. I always tell women add things instead of thinking about taking things away. But exercise, like some kind of exercise, because, the dating on the apps and it's a dopamine hit. That's really what you're getting, right? If you're like on an app or you're drinking wine or something, it's a momentary satisfaction. So if you can get your mind right through exercise and your body right, you can mitigate some of that desire, I think, to get your needs met that way. And it's also teaching you to get your needs met through yourself, not through somebody else. Yeah. Because I think sometimes when women date quickly, and you can probably speak to this, they never get a chance to discover who they are, and the same mistakes are repeated over and over again. So I always encourage them to find ways to like meditate or do something that's internal. So yoga, meditation. And then to your point about the support system, I think every woman should be in a support group, because I think women especially function well in community, and we support one another. And I was in a divorce support group when I went through it. And the cool thing about it, there are a lot of cool things, was that every woman is in a different phase of her divorce. So some of them are still in the marriage, some of them are thinking about leaving, some of them are at the end of it. But it's so healing to be able to talk to other women, to know that you're not going to feel like this forever, or, if you're somebody who's just starting and to talk to somebody who's midway through the process or something.
Where do you find a divorce group, say?
Mine was online.
Okay.
Mine's online.
You can Google divorce group and you might find something, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if I can drop names here, but there's a great
Why
one.
not?
Kate Anthony has a wonderful divorce group. It's the Divorce Survival. She has the Divorce Survival podcast, and so she is. I am in her group still, and she's the one that runs the group, and she actually runs retreats for people. Wonderful. And you can just Google her name or Google, Divorce Survival podcast, and
Both of you spoke of the same thing about learning your identity again, knowing who you are. Speaking for myself, I had that same experience when I was getting a divorce, is that I realized that my identity was my marriage. Yeah. And it wasn't comfortable for me to be in my own head. Have you ever heard that expression before, where you can't be alone? You're by yourself and it's not comfortable anymore. And it wasn't until you did get comfortable like that you were healthy again, and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think we live in a society that really makes it easy to not be in your own head. Regardless of where you are and what your relationship status is, we've got distraction all the time. And look, being in our heads and being in our bodies is not going to be comfortable all the time. And we have lots of great ways to avoid that discomfort. So it takes flexing that muscle and finding ways to connect with yourself, because that's not the way our society is set up.
Do people with gray divorces have any bigger challenges during that split or after the split than maybe a younger person might have? Can you think of any?
Well, there's obviously the financial piece. I think there's which you have already talked about in other segments. But I think coming back to the identity piece, it's, what we understand about the science of attachment is that when we are in a long-term relationship, there is an element of our identity that fuses with the other person. Our preferences, the way we talk, our mannerisms. It's not codependency, it's normal attachment. And so when that's suddenly taken away from you, that sort of leaves you, without a ground underneath your feet in terms of how you're seeing yourself. So I think coming back to the identity piece, that is one of the biggest things that I think is going to be more impactful after you've been partnered for 20 or 30 or 40 years versus somebody who's been partnered for 5 or 10 years. And the other piece that I think is a big loss is, regardless of the satisfaction of the marriage, there is something to be said about the emotional equity. You know, you think about equity in a house that you pay into every month when you pay your mortgage, right? And you pay that equity into it thinking one day you're going to get something out, which is the security of having a mortgage-free house, right?
Right.
We put in emotional equity in our marriage. And so the longer you've been married, the longer you've been partnered, the more equity you've put in. And then when the divorce happens, it's like you've just gone bankrupt. Right. And so the emotional equity is also a huge loss. You know, there's this person, again, regardless of how great or how bad the relationship is, there's this person that probably knows you better than anybody else on the
You've
planet.
invested all your time and effort in this thing, and then suddenly there's nothing to hold on to at the end of it.
Exactly.
You know, I was thinking that, you know, when you're a little bit younger, in your 20s, you get a divorce, you're back into that pool of young people and stuff. But, you know, if you're in your 50s, 60s, or 70s, you don't even know where to look to meet new people. You don't know really. It's more of a struggle, I would think. You know, I know that you know in the olden days when I was in the 20s, you know, it was very easy to just go to a dance place or something like that. People don't dance anymore. You know, and if you go there at the
I'll go dancing with you, Don.
Thank you. If you and I go to a dance place, you know, at my age, you know, you're going to find that we don't fit, and you know, it's just like you're a different person in a different era of your time of your life, you know, and I would think that that's a struggle as well. But I think that you had mentioned joining some groups, you know, community groups and stuff.
Yeah, I think, and there are lots of them. I know that, you know, churches and synagogues, if that's something that you're interested in, but you can look online and find something, and you can form some really good friendships, and these women can see you, you know, through it.
There's groups also like the Pasadena Villages. Have you ever heard of that before? Lori? I bet you haven't.
No.
You're too young. Okay, so you ever heard of the Villages in Florida?
Yes.
Okay, that's where the people go there and they have fun and they're, you know, retired and stuff. Well, believe it or not, there's a movement in America to have these villages that are community based rather than, you know, the senior housing and stuff. And Pasadena actually has it, and they do provide a lot of get-togethers for folks and stuff. So you know, a good resource like that would be good, I would think. Yeah. So, any success stories that you could talk about without naming names?
You know, I love watching people rediscover themselves. You know, in my work, regardless of where somebody is in their relationship status, nobody ever comes to me having a really healthy relationship with themselves. And so, you know, the success that I see in my work is really watching people come home to themselves, discover things about themselves, not just their resilience and their perseverance, but what brings them joy, what brings them.
I was just thinking trying to find the joy in the simple moments in life, you know, that, you know, for me, it's just sitting at home alone.
Yeah, and I bet there was a time when that idea was terrifying to you.
Yes, it was, and now I look forward to it. I embrace it. I embrace that I'm over my 40s.
Well, this has been a really, really good show, you know, and I've been meaning to have this conversation for a long time. So I want to thank both of you for coming on here and shedding some light on a phenomenon that I think most divorce attorneys are like, what is going on here? And especially the community doesn't understand it. You know, if you're in a family and you see your grandparents getting a divorce, now at least they have some context. And I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
For having me.
Of course.
Yeah.
Glad.
Great divorce isn't simply about ending a marriage. It's about creating a new beginning with confidence, clarity, and the right support. If you have a question you'd like Dawn to answer on a future episode, visit talkindivorce.com and just fill out the contact information. And don't forget to follow us on YouTube at Talkin Divorce for full episodes, expert interviews, and practical guidance. And thanks again for watching Talkin Divorce. See you next time.